The observation deck at Viridian Station buzzed with excitement. Families from dozens of different worlds pressed against the railings, their eyes fixed on the most popular attraction in this section of the galaxy. The crystal falls weren't like any waterfall back on Earth. Here, bioluminescent water didn't just fall down, it danced through invisible gravity fields, twisting up, spiraling sideways, creating patterns that defied every natural law humans grew up with. Jake Martinez stood on the upper maintenance walkway, his toolkit balanced on the railing while he worked on a faulty sensor panel. He'd been fixing things on this station for 3 years now, and the wonder of alien technology had mostly worn off. To him, the crystal falls were just another system that needed constant maintenance. The gravity generators were temperamental, the water recyclers clogged every other week, and tourists kept breaking safety protocols. Below him, the crowd was thicker than usual. It was peak season, when multiple species holiday cycles overlapped. Jake could pick out the tall, crystalline heparins catching light like walking prisms. A family of furry centauri stood nearby, their 6 legs shuffling excitedly. There were at least a dozen other species he recognized and twice as many he didn't. Near the front of the crowd, a young Threll girl had slipped away from her family group. Jake noticed her because Threll children were rare on the station. They needed special atmospheric conditions, and their parents usually kept them close. This one looked about 10 in human years, though Jake knew that didn't mean much with alien species. She had pale blue skin that seemed almost translucent, large dark eyes that took up half her face, and delicate features that made her look fragile as glass. She was mesmerized by the water, creeping closer to the edge with each passing second. Her small 3-fingered hands reached toward the glowing streams. Jake felt a twinge of concern but pushed it aside. The barriers were solid. The safety fields were active. Parents were responsible for their kids. He turned back to his panel, twisting a connector into place. That's when he heard the sound. Not a scream, more like a collective gasp from hundreds of throats, in dozens of different registers and tones. Jake's head snapped up. The Threll girl was gone from the edge. No, not gone. In the water. The gravity field must have flickered, just for a second, and she tumbled forward into the pool. Time seemed to slow down. Jake watched the girl thrash in the water, her movements frantic and uncoordinated. Her mouth opened wide, but no sound came out. Her gills, those delicate slits along her neck that Threll used to filter their specialized atmosphere, flared desperately, uselessly. They weren't designed for water. She was drowning. The crowd reacted instantly. Devices appeared in hundreds of hands. Recording lights blinked on like stars emerging at dusk. Alien voices rose in a cacophony of concern, surprise, and shock. But nobody moved toward the water. Nobody reached out. Jake couldn't believe what he was seeing. There had to be 2, maybe 300 beings on that observation deck. Advanced species. Civilized worlds. People who'd crossed the stars in ships that made Earth's technology look like stone tools. And they were all just standing there. Some were recording from multiple angles, adjusting their position for better shots. Others seemed frozen, their alien faces showing expressions Jake couldn't fully read but that looked like uncertainty or fear. A few were backing away, creating more distance between themselves and the emergency. He caught fragments of conversation, translated automatically by his earpiece. A heparin was explaining to its companion that physical contact with unknown species was forbidden in their culture. A centauri was loudly wondering where the station's emergency response team was. Someone else was commenting on liability issues and proper protocols. The girl was still thrashing, but her movements were getting weaker. Slower. Jake could see her small body starting to sink beneath the surface. Something hot and angry ignited in his chest. These people, these advanced, sophisticated, star-traveling people, were going to let a child die while they documented it. While they discussed protocols and cultural sensitivities and proper procedures, a little girl was drowning. Jake's toolkit clattered to the floor. His safety harness hit the walkway a second later. He didn't think about the regulations he was breaking or the fact that he'd never been a strong swimmer. He didn't think about the unpredictable gravity fields or the fact that he had no idea about Threll physiology or whether he could even help. He just thought about that small blue hand clawing at the water. About parents somewhere in that crowd who were about to lose their daughter. About the fact that every second spent thinking was another second she spent dying. Jake climbed onto the railing. The crowd below hadn't noticed him yet. They were too busy watching the girl, recording the tragedy, waiting for someone official to do something. He jumped. And as he fell toward the glowing water, he screamed the only thing that mattered. "Grab my hand." The water hit Jake like a wall of ice. For a split second, Every muscle in his body seized up from the shock. Then survival instinct kicked in and he forced himself to move, kicking hard toward where he'd seen the girl go under. Except nothing worked the way it should. The gravity fields that made the water dance so beautifully for tourists turned the pool into a nightmare for anyone actually in it. Jake kicked downward and found himself moving sideways. He tried to correct and suddenly the current yanked him upward, spinning him around until he couldn't tell which way was which. His lungs already burned. Water filled his nose. He broke the surface, gasped for air, and caught a glimpse of the crowd above. The observation deck was packed now. Word had spread and hundreds more beings had rushed to watch. The recording lights had multiplied, creating a constellation of blinking dots along the railings. Still, nobody else had jumped in. Jake sucked in another breath and dove back under. The water glowed with that eerie bioluminescence, casting everything in shades of blue and green. He could see the girl now, maybe 15 feet away, her small body tumbling through an invisible current that pulled her in circles. Her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth opening and closing as water flooded in. Her movements were getting weaker. He swam toward her, fighting against water that pushed and pulled in ways that made no sense. Earth physics didn't apply here. He reached out, his fingers just inches from her wrist, when a current grabbed him and flung him backward. His shoulders slammed into something hard, the wall, maybe, or one of the decorative rocks they'd placed around the pool. Pain shot through his arm but Jake barely noticed. He kicked forward again, harder this time. His clothes felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds, dragging him down even as the artificial gravity tried to push him up and sideways. His work boots were like concrete blocks on his feet. Above the water, he could hear muffled sounds. Voices shouting in dozens of languages. The wail of station alarms finally kicking in. The crowd was getting louder, more agitated. Through the distorted surface, he could see them gesturing, pointing, offering advice from the safety of the deck. But still, nobody else entered the water. Jake's hand closed on empty water where the girl had been a second before. The current had pulled her away again. He was running out of air. His vision was starting to blur at the edges. He'd never been a strong swimmer, just an average guy who occasionally went to the community pool back home. This was way beyond anything he'd ever done. For a moment, doubt crept in. What if he couldn't save her? What if they both drowned while hundreds of people watched and recorded? What if he was just making things worse? Then he saw her hand break the surface one more time, those 3 delicate fingers clawing desperately at nothing, and the doubt vanished. He didn't care if he drowned trying. At least she wouldn't die alone with an audience. Jake kicked with everything he had left. His legs screamed in protest. His lungs felt like they were being crushed. But he pushed through the current, reached out, and this time his fingers caught her wrist. He had her. The girl panicked immediately, thrashing and twisting in his grip. Her strength surprised him. Terror gave her a surge of energy. Her other hand struck his face, her movements wild and uncoordinated. Jake held on, wrapping his arm around her small body and pulling her against his chest. She fought him every second, not understanding that he was trying to help. Now he had to get them out. Jake kicked toward the surface, toward the main platform, but the current was too strong. It pulled them sideways, then down. His boots scraped against the bottom of the pool. They were sinking. His vision tunneled. Black spots danced at the edges. He needed air. They both needed air. But the platform might as well have been a mile away. Then Jake saw it. A dark rectangular shape in the pool wall, maybe 20 feet to his left. An emergency maintenance hatch. He'd installed the sensor array on that thing 8 months ago. It led to a service tunnel that ran beneath the observation deck. 20 feet. Might as well have been 20 miles with the way the currents fought him. But it was closer than the platform. It was their only shot. Jake adjusted his grip on the girl and kicked toward the hatch. His vision was fading fast. His body screamed for oxygen. The girl had stopped fighting now, gone limp in his arms. That was worse somehow. Much worse. 10 feet. The current tried to push them past the hatch. Jake grabbed a protruding pipe and used it to pull them closer. 5 feet. His hand found the hatch release. 3 feet. The mechanism was stiff, designed to resist accidental opening. Jake pulled with strength he didn't know he had left. The hatch opened. Station alarms screamed louder as sensors detected the breach. Emergency protocols activated. Jake didn't care about any of it. He pulled himself and the girl into the dark tunnel, dragging them both through before the automatic systems could seal them out. The hatch slammed shut behind them. Water poured in through the gap for a few seconds before the seals engaged. Then silence. Jake collapsed on the cold metal floor, his body convulsing as he coughed up water. His chest heaved, dragging in precious air. Beside him, the Thrall girl lay completely still. Water leaked from her mouth and gills. Her chest didn't move. She wasn't breathing. Jake's hands shook as he rolled the girl onto her side. His mind raced through fragments of training he'd barely paid attention to during station orientation. Something about Thrall physiology being different. Their respiratory system worked backwards from humans, or sideways, or something. He couldn't remember the details. All he knew was that water had to come out before air could go in. He pressed his hands against her back, firm but careful. She felt so fragile, like he might break her if he pushed too hard. Nothing happened. He pressed again, harder this time, trying to compress her lungs or gills or whatever Thrall had inside that delicate chest. Water trickled from her mouth. Not enough. Jake repositioned his hands and pushed again, putting his weight into it. More water came up, then a gush of it, spilling across the tunnel floor. The girl's body convulsed. She made a horrible rattling sound, like machinery trying to start, and then she gasped. Air rushed into her lungs. Her gills fluttered weakly. Another gasp, stronger this time. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and terrified. She tried to sit up, coughing and choking. Jake slumped against the tunnel wall, his entire body shaking. His clothes dripped water onto the floor. His shoulder throbbed where he'd hit the wall. None of it mattered. The girl was breathing. She was alive. That's when the tunnel door burst open. Security poured in, followed by medical teams in white suits carrying equipment Jake didn't recognize. Behind them came two adult Thrall, their faces twisted in expressions of panic that transcended species. The girl's parents. The mother dropped to her knees beside her daughter, speaking rapidly in a language Jake's AP struggled to translate. The father was saying something to the medical team, gesturing frantically. They surrounded the girl, scanning her with devices, wrapping her in thermal blankets, lifting her onto a floating stretcher. Jake tried to stand and nearly fell. A human security officer caught his arm. Easy there. Medics need to check you out too. I'm fine, Jake muttered, but he let them lead him out anyway. His legs didn't seem to be working properly. The observation deck was chaos. Station security had cordoned off the area. The crowd had tripled in size, beings pressing against the barriers trying to see what was happening. When Jake emerged from the tunnel, soaking wet and barely able to walk, a strange sound rippled through the assembled aliens. Not quite applause, but something like recognition. Acknowledgement. Then the cameras turned to him. Not just tourist devices now, but professional news equipment. Media crews from a dozen different networks had somehow already arrived. Jake raised his hand to shield his eyes from the lights, confused about what was happening. Just get him to medical, the security officer said, pushing through the crowd. No statements right now. Jake spent 2 hours in the station's medical bay. They checked his lungs for water, scanned for internal injuries, treated his bruised shoulder, and gave him about 16 different warnings about the dangers of jumping into gravitationally unstable water features. He nodded through all of it, exhausted and just wanting to go home to his quarters. When they finally released him, his supervisor was waiting outside with an expression Jake couldn't quite read. You're either the bravest idiot I've ever met or the dumbest hero, the supervisor said. Haven't decided which yet. Can I just go to bed? Jake asked. Yeah. But Martinez? Check your messages first. Your comms probably exploded by now. Jake pulled out his personal communicator on the way back to his quarters. 37 missed calls. 214 messages. What the hell? He opened his messages and his stomach dropped. Video links. Hundreds of them. His face on news sites from worlds he'd never heard of. Headlines in languages his translator had to work overtime to convert. Human risks life while hundreds watch. Lone rescuer saves drowning child as crowd records. Why did only one being jump? Jake sat down on his narrow bunk and opened one of the videos. It was security camera footage from the observation deck, shot from above. He watched himself jump from the upper walkway, saw the crowd of hundreds standing motionless around the pool, their recording devices raised. The contrast was stark. Undeniable. While he fought the currents on screen, the camera periodically panned across the crowd. Some beings were backing away. Others were adjusting their angle for better shots. A few seemed to be arguing about something, but nobody moved to help. Nobody even looked like they were considering it. The video had been viewed 900 million times. In 6 hours. Jake scrolled through the comments, his translator working to convert alien languages into something he could understand. The responses ranged from grateful to angry to deeply uncomfortable. This human showed more courage than our entire delegation. Shameful. What has our civilization become that we document rather than act? Easy for humans to judge. They don't understand our cultural protocols about physical contact. Protocols? A child was dying. That transcends protocol. The human was reckless. What if he'd made things worse? But he didn't make things worse. He saved her. Where were the rest of us? The debate was spreading across the galactic network like wildfire. News anchors from a dozen worlds were discussing it. Political commentators were writing think pieces. The video had apparently sparked something bigger than just one rescue. It had held up a mirror to galactic society, and a lot of species didn't like what they saw reflected back. Jake's communicator buzzed with another incoming message. This one was official, marked with the seal of the Galactic Council. His hands went numb as he opened it. Jake Martinez, human, maintenance worker, Viridian Station. Your presence is requested at an emergency council session to discuss the incident at Crystal Falls and its broader implications for interspecies cooperation and ethical standards. Transportation will be arranged. This is not optional. Jake read it 3 times. The Galactic Council. The actual governing body of 200 worlds wanted to talk to him. About what? Jumping in a pool? His communicator buzzed again. A message from the Earth Embassy. Then another from the Thrall government. Then a request from 6 different news networks wanting interviews. Jake turned off his communicator and lay back on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. 12 hours ago, he'd been a nobody. Just a maintenance guy fixing broken sensors and unclogging water filters. Now his face was apparently on every news feed in the galaxy because he'd done something that seemed so obvious to him. He'd seen a kid drowning. He jumped in. What else was there to discuss? But apparently, for the rest of the galaxy, there was a lot to discuss. And somehow, whether he wanted it or not, Jake Martinez had just become the center of the biggest conversation the civilized worlds had had in decades. All because he couldn't stand by and watch someone die. The Galactic Council chamber was nothing like Jake had imagined. He'd expected something sleek and futuristic, all gleaming metal and holographic displays. Instead, it felt ancient. The walls were carved from some dark stone that seemed to absorb light. 200 environmental pods lined the circular room in rising tiers, each one customized for its species' needs. Some were filled with water. Others glowed with heat or crackled with cold. A few were just empty air, like his own. Jake stood at the center of it all, feeling like a bug under a microscope. He wore the nicest clothes he owned, which wasn't saying much. A borrowed jacket from the Earth Embassy that didn't quite fit his shoulders. Shoes that pinched his feet. He'd spent the last 3 days being prepped for this moment by diplomats who kept using words like optics and messaging until his head spun. All he wanted was to go back to fixing air filters. The chamber hummed with conversation in 100 different languages. Jake's translator earpiece worked overtime, feeding him a constant stream of voices. Most of it was political talk he didn't understand. But some of it cut through clearly enough. Why is a maintenance worker being called before the council? The human planet pushes its agenda as always. This is unprecedented. One rescue does not warrant. A deep tone silenced the chamber. The council speaker, a being whose species Jake couldn't identify, made some kind of formal announcement. Jake's earpiece translated it as something about emergency sessions and matters of galactic importance. It all sounded very official and completely insane. Then an elderly Thrall rose from his pod. His skin was darker than his granddaughter's had been, marked with silver patterns that reminded Jake of tree bark. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many years. I am Council Member Tavik. The child who nearly died at Crystal Falls was my granddaughter, Kess. The old alien's voice cracked slightly. Jake Martinez saved her life. He dove into dangerous waters while hundreds of beings from dozens of worlds stood by and watched. For this, my family owes him a debt we can never repay. The chamber was absolutely silent. Tavik turned slowly, looking at his fellow council members. But his actions have forced us to confront an uncomfortable truth. What have we become as a galactic civilization when we document tragedy instead of preventing it? That opened the floodgates. Voices erupted from all corners of the chamber. A crystalline being argued that their species' cultural prohibition against physical contact with strangers was thousands of years old and shouldn't be dismissed. A floating entity countered that cultural values meant nothing if they prevented basic compassion. Jake stood in the center, forgotten for the moment, as 200 worlds argued about what his jump into a pool really meant. Finally, the speaker called for order. The human will address the council. Every eye in the chamber turned to Jake. His mouth went dry. He stepped up to the speaking platform, gripping its edges so hard his knuckles went white. "I'm not good at speeches," he started. "I fix things for a living. Air filters, mostly. Sometimes water recyclers. I'm nobody important." "Yet you did what hundreds of important beings did not," Tavik said gently. "Tell us why." Jake looked around the chamber. These were the leaders of the galaxy. Beings who'd lived for centuries, who commanded star fleets, who made decisions affecting trillions of lives. And they were asking him to explain something that seemed so simple. "I saw a kid drowning," he said. "That's it. I didn't think about protocols or cultural differences or any of that. I just saw somebody's daughter dying, and I couldn't stand there and let it happen." A tall, thin being with too many joints rose from its pod. "But what if you had failed? What if your interference had caused more harm? You had no training in thrall physiology. You could have killed her." Jake met the alien's gaze. "Yeah, I could have. But you know what definitely would have killed her? Everybody standing around doing nothing while she drowned." His voice got harder. "At least if I'd failed, she wouldn't have died alone while people took pictures of it." The chamber erupted again. Some voices sounded angry. Others thoughtful. Jake caught fragments through his translator. "The human speaks with emotion, not logic. Perhaps we've relied too much on logic and forgotten. This is exactly the kind of reckless behavior that makes humans dangerous. Or perhaps it makes them necessary." A being made of what looked like living fog spoke next. "Human Martinez, your people are relatively new to galactic society. You don't understand the complexities of interspecies interaction. Physical contact can be deeply offensive to some cultures. Intervention without knowledge can cause harm. We have protocols for emergencies, trained response teams." "Where were they?" Jake interrupted, knowing he probably wasn't supposed to but not caring. "Your trained response teams? Because I watched a little girl sink for what felt like forever, and the only people who showed up were people with cameras." The fog being seemed to recoil. Another council member spoke up, this one with a gentler tone. "We understand your frustration. But you must see that the galaxy is more complicated than one station, one moment. We have treaties, agreements, centuries of diplomatic work to maintain peace between species with vastly different values." "I get that," Jake said. "I do. But when did keeping the peace become more important than keeping people alive?" That question hung in the air. Nobody seemed to have a quick answer. Over the next hour, Jake listened to debates that made his head spin. Some council members argued passionately that the galaxy needed to rethink its approach to emergency response and cross-species cooperation. Others insisted that human values couldn't be imposed on the entire galaxy. A few suggested that maybe there was middle ground, some way to balance cultural sensitivity with basic compassion. They showed clips from other incidents that had happened since Crystal Falls. A heparin merchant who'd broken his species taboo on physical contact to pull a tourist from a malfunctioning transport tube. A group of young Centauri who'd formed a volunteer emergency network on their homeworld, inspired by Jake's actions. The footage showed them training together, learning basic response techniques for different species. "These incidents represent a concerning trend," one council member argued. "Beings abandoning their cultural values because of one viral video. Or perhaps," Tavik countered quietly, "they represent beings remembering values we'd forgotten. The value of acting when someone needs help. The value of trying, even when we're unsure." The debate went on until Jake's head pounded. Finally, mercifully, the speaker called for a recess. Jake stumbled out of the chamber, desperate for fresh air and silence. He found neither. The corridor outside was packed with reporters. But standing among them, looking small and out of place, was Kess. She'd recovered fully, her blue skin bright and healthy. When she saw Jake, her face lit up. She pushed through the crowd and stopped in front of him. Then, in front of dozens of cameras, she did something that made Jake's throat tight. She reached out her 3-fingered hand and took his 5-fingered one. "Thank you," she said in careful, practiced English. "For not just watching." Jake squeezed her hand gently. "You're welcome, kid." 6 months passed before Jake finally felt like his life was getting back to normal. The media storm had eventually died down. The Galactic Council had issued some kind of lengthy statement about cultural values and emergency protocols that Jake never bothered to read all the way through. The galaxy moved on to its next controversy, its next crisis, its next viral moment. But some things had changed. Small things, mostly. Things that wouldn't make headlines but mattered anyway. Jake still worked maintenance on Viridian Station. Still fixed air filters and unclogged water recyclers. Still wore the same worn-out work clothes and ate lunch in the employee cafeteria where the food was cheap and never quite hot enough. But now, when he walked through the station corridors, people nodded at him. Not making a big deal of it, just acknowledging him. A Heparin merchant who used to ignore him now said good morning in passing. A group of Centauri workers invited him to join their card game during breaks. His communicator still got messages from across the galaxy. Not the flood of those first few weeks, but a steady trickle. Thank you notes, mostly. Stories from beings who said his actions had made them think differently. A few marriage proposals from species he'd never heard of, which his supervisor found hilarious. Jake deleted those without responding. One evening, after his shift ended, Jake found himself walking back to the Crystal Falls observation deck. He hadn't been back since that day. Hadn't wanted to. But something pulled him there, some need to see it again without the chaos and the crowds and the fear. The falls had been completely redesigned. The gravity fields were more stable now, programmed with redundancy systems and fail-safes. The barriers were higher, reinforced. Emergency access hatches had been clearly marked every 20 feet around the pool. Response equipment hung in sealed cases on every wall, with instructions printed in 40 different languages. Jake noticed something else too. A small memorial plaque had been installed near the main viewing area. He walked over to read it, expecting to see his name or maybe Kess's. But the plaque was simpler than that. Just 3 words carved into polished metal. Reach out your hand. I helped design it. Jake turned to find Kess standing behind him. She'd grown over the past 6 months. Taller, stronger. Her parents stood a respectful distance away, giving them space. Kess wore a small breathing device on her collar now, a precaution her parents insisted on in public spaces. It's good, Jake said. Simple. To the point. That's what you taught everyone, Kess said. She spoke English much better now, with only a slight accent that Jake couldn't quite place. That helping someone doesn't need to be complicated. You just reach out. They stood together in silence, watching the water flow through its careful patterns. The observation deck was moderately crowded, families and tourists enjoying the show. But Jake noticed differences here too. The barriers had signs warning people to stay back, yes, but they also had signs explaining what to do if someone fell in. Emergency call buttons were everywhere, big and obvious. And the crowd itself seemed more aware, more attentive. Parents kept closer watch on their children. Adults stood ready to help if needed, not just to watch. Want to see something? Kess asked. She led Jake around the pool to a quieter section where a group of children played in a shallow area designed specifically for them. Human kids, Threll kids, young Centauri, and a few species Jake didn't recognize. They splashed and laughed together while adults from a dozen different worlds stood watch. Not just stood watch. Actually stood ready. Jake saw a human woman helping a young Heparin child who'd slipped on the wet deck. A Centauri father was showing a human boy how to navigate the shallow gravity field safely. A Threll mother was kneeling beside a crying Centauri child, comforting him in a language she probably didn't speak, but her meaning was clear enough. This is new, a voice said beside Jake. He turned to find Tavik, the council member who'd spoken at that session 6 months ago. The old Threll looked tired but satisfied. Before your actions, many species wouldn't have mixed like this. Too many concerns about cultural boundaries, proper protocols, liability issues. What changed? Jake asked. Tavik gestured at the scene before them. You showed us that sometimes the most important protocol is having no protocol at all. Just caring enough to act. He paused, watching his granddaughter talk with Jake. The council debated for weeks after your testimony. Some members wanted to establish new cross-species emergency response regulations. Others argued against imposing values across cultures. In the end, we did neither. So nothing changed officially? Everything changed unofficially, Tavik said with a slight smile. Medical stations across 70 worlds have started voluntary training programs in multi-species emergency care. Cultural exchange programs now include practical cooperation exercises, not just theoretical understanding. Young beings from dozens of civilizations have formed volunteer response networks. He nodded toward the children playing. And parents like these have decided that teaching their children to help others matters more than maintaining perfect cultural separation. Jake watched a small human girl help a Threll boy climb out of the pool, their hands clasped together without hesitation. 6 months ago, that simple act of helping would have been unusual enough to draw stares. Now it was just normal. The galaxy hasn't transformed overnight, Tavik continued. Many species still struggle with these ideas. Some reject them entirely. Old habits die slowly, especially habits thousands of years old. But seeds have been planted. Understanding has begun. A commotion near the main pool caught their attention. A young centauri had slipped and fallen in, tumbling into deeper water. For just a second, Jake's body tensed, ready to jump in again. But he didn't need to. 3 beings moved at once. A human teenager dove in from one side. A heparin adult entered from the other, moving with surprising grace despite their crystalline body structure. Even a Vorlan, one of those rigid, protocol-obsessed species that had argued most strongly against Jake at the council session, splashed into the shallow end to help guide the child to safety. They had the Centauri child out in seconds, all 3 rescuers working together without discussion or hesitation. The child's parents rushed over, thanking the helpers profusely. The crowd that had gathered applauded, actual applause this time, not just that ambiguous acknowledgement sound Jake had heard 6 months ago. You see? Tavik said quietly. This happens now. Not everywhere. Not always. But more and more. Kes slipped her hand into Jake's, the gesture familiar now, comfortable. I learned to swim, she announced proudly. Really swim, not just float around in the shallow part. Dad says I'm better at it than most throw my age. That's great, kid, Jake said. He meant it. The fact that she'd faced her fear, that she'd gone back into the water instead of letting that day define her forever, that mattered more than any council debate. I want to help teach other Thrall children, Kes continued. So they're not scared of water like I was. So if something happens, they know what to do. Jake looked down at this young alien girl who'd almost died in his arms. Now she wanted to help others. The ripple effect spreading outward in ways he never could have imagined. Tourists still took photos of the crystal falls. The water still flowed in those impossible beautiful patterns. But now, Jake noticed, when someone got too close to the edge or stumbled on the wet deck, hands reached out to steady them. Human hands, alien hands, hands with 3 fingers or 6 or none at all. Different shapes, different colors, different species, but all moving with the same instinct to help. It wasn't perfect. Jake knew that. The galaxy was still complicated, still struggling with questions about culture and values and how beings from vastly different worlds could coexist. But at least now those questions included how do we help each other, instead of just how do we avoid conflict. The sun was setting outside the station's massive viewport, painting the observation deck in shades of orange and gold. Jake stood with Kes and her grandfather, watching the children play while their parents stood ready, watching not with fear or suspicion but with care and attention. You know what the best part is? Kes said suddenly. People don't recognize you as much anymore. You can just be normal again. Jake laughed. Thank God for that. But they remember what you did, she added. They remember that someone cared enough to jump. And now, when they see someone who needs help, they remember to reach out their hand too. That's all it had ever been, really. One maintenance worker seeing a child in trouble and deciding he couldn't just stand there. No grand philosophy, no complex debate about cultural values. Just the simple human refusal to be a bystander when someone needed help. The water flowed. The children laughed. And across the galaxy, on hundreds of worlds and thousands of small moments that would never make the news, beings were reaching out their hands to help each other. Because someone had shown them that sometimes, that's all it takes. One person deciding that caring matters more than caution. One voice cutting through the noise and the fear and the careful distance civilized beings kept between themselves. 3 words that changed everything. Grab my hand.